Hey everyone, we are back again with another D group teaching. We are continuing on in our God is series, which is a series where we're talking about the different attributes of God, why they matter, and how they can kind of serve to deepen our relationship with Him. So we are basing kind of these attributes of God off of Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. We've already gone through it week over week, but I'm going to just remind us of that today. So it says, the Lord passed before him, that being Moses on Mount Sinai, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And this week, we are going to be looking into God's attribute of mercy. That's what we're going to be looking at. But first, I think it's a little helpful for us to go over some definitions, just so that we're clear on stuff before we get rolling here. And as we see in this passage, and many passages throughout the Bible, grace and mercy are often coupled together when describing God. And why is that? Well, it's because both grace and mercy are actually a product of God's attribute of goodness. Okay, God's goodness is always constant, and it's not just there for one person and not there for someone else. Like, He is completely, wholly good. And so He expresses His goodness to us in different ways, like grace, like mercy. Now, mercy, which is what we're talking about today, is God's goodness towards those who are in misery or distress, okay? While grace is God's goodness towards those who deserve only punishment. So today we're talking about mercy, okay? So I'm going to remind you again, it's God's goodness towards those who are in misery and distress. And today we're going to be looking at the story of Jonah, where we will learn about this attribute, God's attribute of mercy. But first, as a group, I want you to share a time when you reached out for help for something and somebody delivered for you. They helped you in that situation. So we learned that Jonah is a really crappy prophet, right? We always learn of prophets in the Bible and we're like, oh, they're so wise. They always know what to say. They're getting stuff directly from God, right? Prophets were basically chosen by God to just spread or share the message that God had for the people. They were also to kind of help with like making wise decisions among the people. And some prophets even were told of things that were going to happen in the future, and they were supposed to kind of warn the people of that, right? But Jonah here, he is not what I would call an A+ prophet. His literal job was to speak on behalf of God. God asked him to do that, which he usually does all the time because he's a prophet. And instead of saying, yeah, God, I'll go do that, he said, actually, I'm going to go this way, a completely opposite way of the place where you want me to speak to the people, right? He runs away. And this seems especially dumb, right? Especially when we know that it's actually impossible for us to escape God, right? God is what we would call omnipresent, okay? And that means He's everywhere all the time, and He's all-knowing as well, right? And Jonah's trying to run away from that, which doesn't make any sense. And I feel like, yeah, Jonah would have to know this on some level too, but he runs away anyways. But the good news is, in this story, we actually learn that God, sometimes when we disobey Him, He still uses us in His plans for good, right? And that's encouraging. And this experience is actually what made the pagan sailors who were sailing with Jonah to turn from their false gods and to look towards the one true God, Jonah's God, in the midst of all that chaos. And then the chapter ends in verse 17. It says, now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Can you imagine what it would be like to be inside of a fish that long? I can't even imagine what it would be like for 30 seconds, let alone 3 days and 3 nights. That would have been so disgusting. Who knows what that fish ate? Who knows what was in that stomach? That would be terrible. But we see that, before he's thrown into the fish, that God answered the prayers of the unsaved sailors. So they were still worshiping their false gods, right? But then they prayed to God, and the storm stopped at once as soon as they threw Jonah over, right? Which prompted them to believe in God, the sailors to commit their lives to God. See, God had mercy on these sailors. And then, when it seems like the end of this story with Jonah, right? He gets swallowed by a fish. What else could happen? Like, he's done for, right? But it's actually just the beginning of Jonah's story. You see, God wasn't done with Jonah yet. He was done with the sailors. He'd proven himself to them. They were devoted to them, but God wasn't done with Jonah yet. So I want you as a group to read Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. Okay, so you might be reading this story and saying, I don't see God's mercy in this story at all. Maybe with the sailors, but like with Jonah, it doesn't really seem like he's being merciful to Jonah. He's in a fish, for crying out loud, right? But God shows us mercy in ways that we don't expect. And it's sometimes really uncomfortable ways. And we like to think when we cry out to God, we like to assume how we would like him to help us, right? Or the way that we think that he could help us the best way, right? And not in the way that God thinks is best. And that's what God's doing in this story with Jonah right now. And, we live in a world that kind of idolizes self-autonomy. And what do I mean by that? It basically means deciding what we want to do with our life, making the decisions we want to make, not really based on any certain moral standard or even religious standard, right? And people are praised for doing that, right? Making decisions that they want, getting after it, getting what they want in life, right? But while not all decisions like that are inherently bad or wrong, it is not how we are called to live as Christians. And see, in Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, it says, Then Jesus told his disciples, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. See, we're called to deny ourselves. And see, Jonah, he decided what he wanted to do for himself instead of God's plan for him. He went with what he wanted. And we do it all the time. See, and he chose what he wanted, not listening to God's instructions, right? He ran away. He went off. He set sail for Tarshish. He had the wind blowing through his hair. He was like, I'm set. This is going to be great, right? And then he winds up in the belly of a fish, okay? And that's where he finds himself. But you might be saying, I still don't see God's mercy in this. This guy is still stuck in a fish. Isn't God just punishing Jonah for what he did by getting him swallowed by this fish? These are great questions to ask, but I want to remind you that sometimes God shows us mercies in ways that we don't expect or are very uncomfortable. And that's what's happening here. So look in verses 5 to 7. It said, The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. The weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down into the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. Now, Jonah, he's crying out in a prayer to God in this fish, right? And he's not speaking like someone that is being punished by God here. You see, he's talking about what it's like to be at the end of himself, to be at rock bottom with nowhere else to turn, nowhere else to run but to his Father, to his God. See, we learn that God uses great mercy to draw us near to him. And that's what's happening to Jonah inside the belly of this fish. See, God is using this experience in the fish to open Jonah's eyes to get a glimpse of God's mercy in his life and in his current situation. It's in Jonah's darkest hours that God showed him that running away from God's plans were only going to lead to death. Running away to Tarshish, it was not going to satisfy Jonah like he thought it would. And maybe it would have been satisfying for a time. Here's a question. Have you ever had a time when you wanted something really badly, and then once you got it, it didn't make you feel how you thought it would? Talk with your group. See, ultimately, we were created to glorify God as Christians. We are called to follow Him. And when we turn for that in favor of our own wants, our own choices, our own plans, we will be dissatisfied because we're living outside of God's design for us. That's why we feel those things. That's why we struggle when we don't get what we want, or when we get it and feeling empty or feeling like it wasn't as important as you thought it was going to be. Right? There's a reason we are called to live in God's design. That is when we enjoy life. Life is more fulfilling. It's not perfect. It's not easy, but it's in God's design, what He has designed for us, how we can thrive. And in this moment, in the belly of the fish, in his darkest hour, Jonah realizes this. You see, he realizes that he is nothing without God. And through God's mercy of this fish, Jonah finally understands how much he needs God. How does verse 5-7 point towards the work that Jesus did on the cross for us? Talk with your group. And see, after Jonah realizes that he can do nothing apart from God, just like we can do nothing apart from Jesus and what He's done on the cross, what does he do? What does Jonah do? In the belly of a stinky fish, in verse 9, in the NLT, Jonah says, "But I will offer sacrifices to you with songs of praise. I will fulfill all my vows, for my salvation comes from the Lord alone." See, he worships God in his rock bottom. And in this story, we see that there is no sin that is beyond God's redemptive reach. Okay, there's no sin that God will not redeem for us. And throughout this story of Jonah, we see that God will meet us in our darkest moments with mercy. And that mercy that God shows us can be uncomfortable. It can be unexpected. It can seem like the last thing we want, right? Like if God was to ask Jonah, "Hey, like I'm about to teach you a lesson. Do you want it, like, you want me to just tell you it, or do you want to like chill in a fish for 3 days? Like, what's your pick?" Right? Like, that's not what happens here. But like, God shows us mercy in ways that we don't expect, but are ultimately for our own good, right? But yeah, the mercy He showed Jonah in this crazy experience was so profound, and it was a turning point in Jonah's life. And there are moments in our lives when we can hit that rock bottom. And as terrible as a situation that can be, as hard as that can be, as lonely as that can be, it forces us to reflect on our life, right? And to see the decisions we've made or decisions other people have made and realize that none of it matters without God. We get to a point where we can't do anything and we just say like, "I'm done. I've tried all I can do," right? And to then cry out to God in those moments. And it can make us see that, we've actually just been trying to get in our own way of God's plans for our life. Right? Constantly trying to be like Jonah and choosing what we want over what God is calling us to do. And through this realization and out of Jonah's worship for God, regardless of his circumstances, it says in verse 10, "And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land." Didn't think we were talking about vomit today, did you? Well, it's in the Bible. But I also want you to understand something super important that this story teaches us as well, okay? It shows, God shows mercy to us in His way, in His time, and it is good. God is good, right? It's that goodness of God that shows up as mercy in our lives. So what does that mean for us? Well, I want you to reflect on this. Is there anywhere that you find that you would fit into Jonah's story? Is God asking you to do something right now? Has God asked you to do something and you're running away from that? Have you wound up at rock bottom with nowhere to go because of some choices you've made or choices somebody else has made that have put you there? Are you mad at God because of something that's happened in your life and you're making choices to go against his plan for you because of it? And I just want you to know I'm asking all of these questions because at some point we all are going to identify with different parts of Jonah's story here. And I've identified with many parts of this story. And another thing that is really important for us to realize here as well is our circumstances are not a good judgment of how God feels towards us. It can be really easy when things are tough to assume that God is mad at us for something. Or maybe you're in a situation because you've sinned, right? It's easy to kind of think, oh, like God is punishing me right now because of what I did there, right? But through God's goodness in the form of great mercy, a fish swallows Jonah, and he has shown what a life without God at the center would look like. And that's what God does in these situations, okay? And Jonah cried out to God, and he was shown great mercy in response to his cries. Because God is good, and he loves us, and he wants what's best for us. And so when we cry out to him and ask for help, we will receive that mercy. It'll be in his way. It won't be what we expect. Thank goodness for that, because it's always better than what we expect. But it will be there for us. See, God's character is unchanging. His faithfulness, we've talked about, his love and his mercies towards those who are suffering, they're good and they're unchanging. So my question for you as you go through your week this week is, where do you see yourself in Jonah's story? And how can you show others God's mercy? Okay, and I'm going to leave you with this verse. Okay, it's Lamentations chapter 2, verses 22 to 23. It says, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." See you next week. Faithfulness. What's going on?
I didn't know if it was too zoomed in.
Oh, is it?
I feel like there's too much white space around.
There is a lot of white space around it.
Did you hear that? He just called me skinny.
Thanks, guys.
That's what I was wondering, because, like, technically, if I was standing, I'd be on the X, but don't zoom in too much, though, okay?
Let's see those
Not too much, okay? Should I then move this table back? Is it weird that the table's cut off? I don't know how camera things work.
Is that in the way? Or is that bad?
It's the boom. Is it this? No, what is that?
That's this.
Oh, the hood?
No?
No.
What is that?
I don't know.
Oh, I think it's this. Yes.
Yes, it
Yep.
is.
It is indeed.
Is that?
Oh, 5 years.
Are you trying to backseat film right now? Welcome back to our ASMR channel. Today we're going to be talking about... Just kidding, no spoilers.